So we're going to get started with the program. This program distributes to Dr. Birnbaum. The first thing I want to say is thank everyone for coming here to this tribute. And we're very pleased. It's very special for us to have here actually relatives of Dr. Birnbaum in Israel. The wife of his nephew and his great nephew have joined us for the Zoom participation. And given the lateness of the hour there, before I give my class, my shiur, my lecture on Dr. Birnbaum, I'd like to ask them to say a few words. So I will unmute. I will unmute them, and they'll be able to speak, and after that we'll continue from there.
Hello, New York. I hope you can hear us loud and clear from Tel Aviv. It's a great honor and a pleasure to see so many people gathering this evening in Tel Aviv and your, I guess, afternoon in New York to honor Dr. Birnbaum. For me, as a child growing at my parents' house, my father and his mother, who was the sister of Dr. Philip Birnbaum, I only saw this scholar, amazing scholar, I guess, once or twice in my life. I'm now 52 years old. My mom here had the pleasure of seeing and being with Dr. Birnbaum many more times. Just an anecdote, because this is my memory of him. There was a visit when he was in New York that he invited my parents to visit him and meet the community, the synagogue, and the place he lived in. And my dad and my mom used to tell me, he was such a modest person in his lifestyle, in his way of living, that the only thing he ate during the day was rice. So his doctor commanded him to really go for a rice diet, and it was in the morning and at lunchtime and in the evening, to be satisfied with stuff that is based on rice. So this is my childhood memory of Dr. Birnbaum. I know it might not be his image and the amazing work that he's done and the Siddur that so many of you have used during the years, but it was fascinating because the connection that was made to Yosef was through a joint friend. He said, I don't believe it. You're a relative of Dr. Birnbaum, says the Machzor, the Siddur. So I'll stop here and really say thank you to Yosef and everyone else who was involved in the very touching ceremony at the cemetery earlier today. And we're anxious to hear more. So thank you from the bottom of our hearts to putting this up. Mom, anything else?
Glad to see you, glad to meet you. I am not direct family to Dr. Philip. My husband was his nephew, but he visited us frequently, and we enjoyed every moment of his presence, of his character, and he was a wonderful person, a warm uncle. Although he lived far away, he was always in contact with us by letters and on ceremony, on the weddings of my two boys. He wrote beautiful things about it. And I thank you also for having this evening in his honor. He should get such an evening that as the one you are doing. He was a very nice person. Thank you.
So if you'll permit me, I should have been on earlier, but we were caught in traffic coming down from Westchester. I'm Lawrence Coburn. I tried to coordinate everything, and we're delighted that the Shafirs could join us and watch, because Dr. Birnbaum was a very, very private person, but very much respected and very much loved in the Jewish Center. Now, as Rabbi Schachter said at the cemetery, the real motivating force for putting all of this together, even though I maybe move some of the moving parts, but the motivation really came from Yosef Lindell. Both Rabbi Schachter and I had seen the old gravestone with its errors, and we sort of said, gee whiz, isn't that too bad? But the person who didn't let it stay that way, who insisted on following through and following with Rabbi Schachter and with Rabbi Levine and myself, and dealing with everybody at the cemetery and the gravestone, was Yosef Lindell. So the honor and the respect and the thanks of the friends of Rabbi Birnbaum, of Dr. Birnbaum, really is owed to him. And with that, I'm very pleased to introduce to you Yosef Lindell, who I've known as a researcher, as one of the editors of Lair House, which is an important online newspaper. But he has a daytime life as an attorney in the Baltimore and the Washington area, and has served as the motivation and the driving force of putting this event together. And we're really all pleased that he could participate, and that you can all now participate and hear from him. With that, Yosef, if you will.
Thank you, Larry. It's really an honor and a privilege to be able to be part of this event as well, and to address all of you. I really wanted to thank Larry for all the work he did in assisting and making sure all the parts moved as he said, and everything went well with the shul, that we were able to complete this properly. I really want to thank the Shafirs, Arnon and his mother Tilly, for joining us and for saying a few words in honor of their relative, Dr. Birnbaum. It's really nice to be able to have made that connection, and to be able to see that indeed, he is remembered by his family, and that kesher between Israel and America exists, and that we can hopefully show the Shafirs as well how much respect we have here for Dr. Birnbaum as users of his works, and as some of us here who knew him as his friends when he was alive. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen, and then you'll all be able to see my source sheet. Also, I believe if I can send a chat to everyone in the meeting here, I just sent a chat, and you can actually download my source sheet directly from that link, and it should just download to your desktop, and then you'll be able to see it there as well. So hopefully that should be helpful as well. So let me share my screen and see. Okay, can everyone see the source sheet now? Okay, great. So every year before Rosh Hashanah, before Yom Kippur, in synagogues across America, there are rituals that take place. Some of these rituals are like, you take down the parochet over the aron, you put up a white one. You do slichot, special penitential prayers that you do before Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. There's another ritual that takes place in some shuls, and that is you bring up the box of Birnbaum machzorim from the basement. Now, or wherever they're kept. Not saying it happens in every shul, but it's still happening in so many shuls today. I think this is extraordinary. Here you have a book, first published in 1951. It was very popular and reprinted regularly until the 1990s. But at some point after that, the publisher, Hebrew Publishing Company, went out of business. And yet we're still using it. And it's actually incredibly influential. Where I live in Silver Spring, Maryland, and where I'm also a Baal Tefillah, I also a Chazan, I lead the prayers sometimes on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. It's actually the official machzor of the shul. Like they tell the Baalei Tefillah, the ones leading the davening, this is the machzor we want you to use. And this is the case even though it's been out of print for 30 years. Now, I think one reason for this is very simple. It takes a long time to turn over stock in a sitter. So, especially when it's only used once or twice a year. So you're not always using it, it's not going to wear out. So you keep it around. But I think there's a lot more than that, because when I wrote an article about Dr. Birnbaum about a year ago, which is what started this whole project, talking about the Machzer and how people are using it, I just got so many responses and people saying, we're so glad that you wrote about this. We're just so interested to learn more about him because we've been using his books all the time. I remember actually here where I'm now at the Jewish Center, Rabbi Levine, the first thing he said to me by email when I reached out about this project to replace the gravestone was, yes, we should definitely do something. I say his name more times on the high holidays than I do almost anyone else's because they're calling out the pages for the Machzer. So really, he has a presence still in synagogues to this day. And I think what I'd like to do here is to talk more about him. And now, so today, I just want to say also, can everyone hear me well enough? Am I loud enough? Okay, great.
We're fine. Keep going.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'd like to allow people to unmute themselves at certain points to ask questions or respond to questions. I'm not as fluent in the Zoom. And Larry, is that something you're able to do? Or I guess people can unmute themselves maybe, hopefully, in case.
By pressing the space bar, you unmute yourself and you can speak.
Okay, great. All right, so now it's not just the Machzer, it's also the Birnbaum Siddur, 1949, published in 1949. That's still widely used in synagogues. Not as much today, but it was used very much in my youth. I remember very fondly, like for example, in my shul, like the Gabbai, he would call out the page numbers of the Birnbaum every tefillah along with the art scroll. And I think it's fair to understand him as a person and writer. He was an immigrant, as we'll learn, a scholar, a translator, a stickler for grammar, a lover of Hebrew language, a frum Jew, and a publishing sensation. And the New York Times called him actually the most obscure best-selling author. So what I want to do in the 30 or so minutes to follow is to try to make him a little less obscure, to understand him better. Very little has actually been written about him, but I hope that's changing now with the work of David Olivestone, actually, who's actually here, who wrote a very important article in Jewish Action, and some of the articles I've written and intend to continue to write about him. He was born sometime between the years 1901 and 1904 in Zarnowiec in Poland, about 35 miles north of Krakow. He was the youngest of 3 children. His family remembers him sitting at night under the table with books and candles, always studying. He was something of an autodidact. He taught himself a lot. He emigrated to North America around 1920, probably because he wanted to study more. His family did not come with him. Much of his family tragically perished in the Holocaust, but his sister Blima and her family went to Tel Aviv after World War II, and the Shafirs here today are their descendants, and we're so happy that they're here. So Paltiel Birnbaum, Philip Birnbaum, when he came to North America, he started off in Montreal, but he went to New York pretty quickly after that. Then in 1923, he went to Birmingham, Alabama. Not exactly sure what brought him there, but it might have been a job. He became the principal of the Talmud Torah there. And in fact, he taught in Talmud Torahs through his entire career. So we're talking about like after school programs mostly to teach people Hebrew and Hebrew literature and Jewish subjects and topics and stuff like that. We're not talking about the full-time day schools that we're often used to today. While he taught in Birmingham, he also earned a college degree from a local school, Howard College, which is actually, interestingly enough, Southern Baptist affiliated. He financed his education by lecturing in Greek and Hebrew. You can see already at that young age, he knew many languages, he knew many things. So in 1935, he leaves Birmingham and he moves to Philadelphia. And he attends Dropsy College, where he earns his PhD in 1939 for a critical edition of an Arabic commentary on Hosea of a medieval Karaite commentator by the name of Yefet Ben Ali. Rabbi Schachter actually mentioned this at the gravestone as well. Now, you might think this is really, really, really obscure. That's what it sounds like. But interestingly, some more of you may be familiar with Dr. Bernard Revel, the first president of Yeshiva University. He also got his PhD in Karaite studies from Dropsy in 1912. So it seems like this was something to do, something that people did. And definitely Dropsy was a very important place to do Jewish scholarship at the time. During the time he was in Philadelphia, he was also the principal of the Talmud Torah in Camden, New Jersey. In 1943, Dr. Birnbaum moved again. this time to Wilmington, Delaware, possibly at the invitation of one of the rabbis in the community. He remained there for 20 years, first heading the Associated Hebrew School and then the Advanced School for Jewish Studies. He was a very important, celebrated member of the community there. But in 1963, he returned actually to New York, where he lived for the rest of his life, and he attended the Jewish Center of Manhattan, where I'm actually sitting today in their Beit Midrash. Toward the end of his life in 1986, he received both the Yeshiva University's Mordechai Ben David Award and the Body of Works citation from the Jewish Book Council, and he passed away in 1988. Let's now turn to his writing career. In 1944, Hebrew Publishing Company, which was one of the major publishing houses of Jewish literature in the United States at the time, it published an abridged version of the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, which basically what Dr. Birnbaum had did is taken select passages from the Mishnah Torah, and he reset the type, he vocalized it, he punctuated it, and he put explanatory English notes at the bottom. So this wasn't the full translation, but it was kind of sort of a helpful explanatory guide to that work. And it was pretty popular. So a few years later, Hebrew Publishing Company asked him to do a full new edition and translation of the Siddur, the daily prayer book. So the Siddur, his Siddur was first published in 1949. It was really successful. It was being used as far away as Hong Kong and Tokyo at some point, and having sold more than 300,000 copies by the time of his death in 1988, probably outselling any other English translation of the Siddur by a wide margin. In the 1951 Maser that we talked about at the beginning was similarly popular. Something about what he was doing struck a chord, and I want to explore that by using some passages from the introduction to his Siddur, and then we'll broaden a little bit to some of his other works. And we'll also, while we're doing that, we'll intersperse a few more biographical details as we go through trying to understand just what he published, what exactly was he trying to do when he published. So if you look at your source sheet now, you look at source number 1, and people always tell me about this when they hear about the project I'm working on. What was one big thing that Dr. Birnbaum did differently? He put everything in the book in the same font and size. If you look, he writes, "For no sound reason, the pages of the Siddur are broken up by several type sizes which have a confusing effect on the eyes of the reader. Those who learn the contents of the prayers soon discover that the emphasis suggested by the larger type is in most cases no emphasis at all. Why, for instance, should one part of the Shema be made to appear more prominent than the other?" So maybe some of you recall a siddur called the Shiloh Siddur. That's the one that I got when I was in first grade, around 1991. I think it was given out because it had very clear, nice, large type, but there are also random differences in the paragraph sizes all over for no apparent reason. So this is a really big thing that Birnbaum did. He wasn't the absolute first one. Yeah, there you go. We have the Shiloh Siddur over here. Yeah. Birnbaum wasn't absolutely the first one to put everything in the same size, but he was one of the earliest and certainly one of the most popular to do that. He also put the davening in order, which is a big deal too. If you look at I'm thinking again to the Shiloh Siddur. So in the Shiloh Siddur, let's say you want to daven mincha, just during the week, regular weekday mincha. So you have your section just stuck with Shachris. There's no separate mincha. So what do? You first have to find Ashrei, then you have to find Shmona Esrei, then flip some more pages, you find Tachanun, then you find Olenu. And it's kind of hard to find things. So Dr. Birnbaum speaks to this also in his introduction when he's in source number 2. He says, "What does it all mean? The answer can be put in one word: confusion. As a result of poor arrangement and inadequate instructions, comparatively few worshipers ever succeed in properly reciting the full Musaf for Chol HaMoed Sukkos." So basically saying, like, you have a confusing thing, like the prayers on Sukkot, which every day there's a different carbon that you have to recite, a different offering that you're talking about. And it's going to be confusing if you don't have it organized in a way that the reader can really figure that out. So he says in this volume, each of the services is arranged as a completely integrated unit, so that the worshiper is not called upon to search from page to page and to commute from reference to reference. The directions are explicit, brief, and to the point. The traditional text is left intact, carefully vocalized, and divided into sentences and clauses by the use of modern punctuation marks. So that's an important thing that he did. Now, I put at the bottom here just some pictures. You have his PhD dissertation that I talked about that he wrote on the Karaite commentator Yefet Ben Ali. I have a note about the publication of his new siddur in 1949. So here in source number 3, I've got for you an old machzer. Now, the story behind for Yom Kippur, and the story behind this is that I got it from my grandfather. My family wasn't, maybe didn't use this machzer so much, but it's from 1903, and it has a beautiful cover. But if you look in sort of the text in the machzer, it actually is really, really difficult to use. If you look, for example, at the page I photocopied for you, what do you got here at the top? You got some large font Hebrew text of some of the prayers. Then you have Yiddish instructions. Then you've got non-vocalized Hebrew text. And here, if you look toward the bottom, right before Aleinu, see where Aleinu is on the bottom, right in front of that, there's some Yiddish I'm going to read to you. We're going to make an attempt to read this Yiddish. So you've just said various things, and it's telling you what to do next. It says, Dan sagt der Chazan v'simloch ata. So after that, the Chazan should say, v'simloch ata, u'bnei chataenu, and u'bnei chataenu v'chodesh hashvi. And then the chodesh hashvi, another paragraph. Biz l'reach nicho achi shel Hashem, until the words reach nicho achi shel Hashem. Man, find it as by the Shmona Esrei. Where are all these prayers I told you to read? Go back to the Shmona Esrei. You'll find them there. We're not reprinting them for you. If you want to say them, you go back, you find them. So you sort of kind of see the problems Dr. Birnbaum was working with. It's a really hard machzer to use. I tried using it one year, I couldn't use it at all, and I'm pretty familiar with the prayers. Very, very, very difficult. So you kind of can appreciate what he was doing and making it so organized. Another really important thing that he was doing was making a readable translation. If you look here at source number 4, some translators, unfortunately, have failed in their task of making intelligible the meaning of the prayers. In their carelessness, they have imitated the antiquated versions of the Bible that abound in phrases like yielded up the ghost instead of died, and filled the siddur with a mass of words which convey little meaning to the mind of the modern Jew. The general complaint that we do not understand what we say is an indictment against many translations of the siddur. And he says, a good translation ought to be authentic and free from deceptions. One must not read into the original what is not there. No new poetry should be introduced into the siddur, presumably as the translation of the Hebrew text. The meaning ought to be preserved as close to the original as possible. If you look then down to source number 5, I have on the next page, give you an example. This is Anim Zemirot, one of the piyutim, one of the poems that we say on Shabbos and on Yom Tov in davening. I'm going to give you different translations of it. So we have the Hebrew text over there. Remember that 1903 machzer I was just telling you about? So here's its translation of the first line. It says, sweet hymns I will sing, and songs will I indite, for unto thee my soul panteth. My soul longeth to dwell in the shadow of thy power, to learn all the secrets of thy mysteries. This is a pretty difficult translation. Very, very hard to understand. Indite apparently is an archaic word for writing or composing. So not very easy to understand. See what Birnbaum has done below. I sing hymns and compose songs because my soul longs for thee. My soul desires thy shelter to know all thy mystery. Much easier to understand. Anyone want to say though, what about this is still kind of interesting, maybe a little unusual or antiquated, even in Birnbaum's translation?
Yeah, thee and thy. Right?
Yeah, right. It still has thee and thy. So that's interesting. Let's go back up to source 4 because he talks about that. He says at the very bottom paragraph there, he says the pronouns thou and thee have been retained where they are addressed to God, since they convey a more reverent feeling than the common you. The diction has not been allowed to reach the level of everyday English in view of the exalted literary tone of the siddur. So he was aware of this. He's like, we don't really use these anymore, this terminology. This is pretty, it is, but he says, I'm going to keep this because he thinks it sounds much more reverent. It's actually really interesting. I don't want to take us on too much of a side tangent, but apparently thou and thee originally were actually the less reverent forms of address for you. It was kind of, if you were addressing a commoner, you would say thou, but if you were addressing a king or something like that, you would actually say you. But over time, it kind of shifted for various reasons. You kind of became the popular one, and then thou was only retained, often like in prayers and stuff like that. But so that is one choice that Birnbaum made to retain that nonetheless. Now, Dr. Birnbaum was also a fan of accurate translations, and he thought overly poetic translations, we read a paragraph about that also, are not great. He doesn't want to introduce new poetry into the siddur. So he was particularly upset. One thing that particularly upset him was a certain group of translations for the Machzer that were done in England in the early 20th century by a Herbert Adler and an Arthur Davis. There's a whole interesting story behind that Machzer as well. I actually recently published an article about this at Lehrhaus, if anyone wants to go look it up. But if you look in the middle paragraph in source 5, where I highlight their Routledge Adler Machzer translation of Israel Zangwill, and this is his translation of Anam Zemiro. Sweet hymns shall be my chant and woven songs, for thou art all for which my spirit longs, to be within the shadow of thy hand and all thy mystery to understand. Anyone want to highlight just a feature that might jump out to you about that translation that's kind of different than the other two here?
Rhyming.
Yeah, it's rhyming. Yeah, this is a really interesting feature of these translations by Zangwill. Does anyone, people know who Zangwill is? Let me just say a word about Zangwill. He was a really interesting figure. He was actually a really famous writer in England in the early 20th century. Apparently, he actually popularized the term melting pot because he wrote a play of that name. He was very involved in Zionism, and he was one of the people who said, when they're having trouble getting the British to agree to a land in Israel in particular, he supported this alternative plan, this Uganda plan to have Jews settle there instead, because he felt it's better for the Jews to have some homeland somewhere, even if it's not in the land of Israel. Zangwill was also not religious, definitely not. He did not give his son a bris milah. He actually married a non-Jewish woman, but he was very, very involved in the Jewish community regardless, and he was very involved in this whole translation project. So Dr. Birnbaum, though, was really not a fan of this kind of translation, because he says, like, you're rhyming it very nice, but it's not very accurate, it's not very literal. And this really came to a head in what you see down below in source number 6. So the Rabbinical Council of America put together a new edition of the Siddur for Shabbat and festivals in 1960. And the translator was Rabbi Dr. David DeSola Poole, who was the rabbi of Shevet Israel, very prominent congregation in New York, one of the oldest congregation in New York. And he had actually incorporated a number of Zangwill's translations and other translations from the Adler Machzer. So Dr. Birnbaum was not happy about this at all. And in Hadoar, he wrote this very scathing review. So what is Hadoar? Hadoar was a Hebrew weekly, one of the longest running Hebrew periodicals in the world. It lasted from 1921 to 2005. It was the publication of the Histadrut Ivrit of America, which promoted Hebraic culture. And this is another thing that Birnbaum found very important. He served on the board of this Histadrut, and he wrote for them all the time. He was constantly writing book reviews, essays about Jewish history. I actually looked through it. I went to the Library of Congress one day and I got their volumes of Hadar out to look, how much did Dr. Paltiel Birnbaum really wrote for Hadar? And the answer is a lot. I feel like every few months, for years and years, he had an article and they only stopped just a few months before he passed away. Then he stopped writing for them. Now, most of these articles are not so well known, mostly because Hadar is not so well known today and not so easy to find. But this review kind of made a splash because he was pretty upset about the translation of the DeSola Poole Siddur. I didn't really make this big enough for you to read. I'm not really going to read this inside directly, but he wrote it. I'll just translate into English one line that I found particularly interesting. There's a prayer for rain recited on Shmini Atzeret, Tfilas Geshem, you're maybe familiar with. And in Zangwill's translation, he says about Avraham, he says, it refers to him as thy blessed son. And Moshe, he calls it thy shepherd son. So to Birnbaum, this didn't sound so great. Why do you think Birnbaum might not have liked these translations off the top of your head? Anyone want to say anything?
Yeah, it sounds Christian, in other words.
Yeah, it sounds kind of Christian. So Dr. Birnbaum was very unhappy about that. And this is what he writes. He writes, could it be, I'm just translating to English, could it be that the rabbis of the RCA approve the translations of Israel Zangwill that are not translations, but free imitation that's infused with expressions from another world, the world of Christianity? And also he says it's particularly bad because the word son, ben, in Hebrew doesn't even appear in the Hebrew at all. So what's Zangwill doing? So basically he was not a huge fan of this. And the editor of the Siddur that Dr. DeSola Poole translated, Rabbi Sharyl Chevelle, responded to this criticism, and they went back and forth a bunch of times in Ador. It really made, it apparently made waves, and a lot of people responded. And actually, Rabbi Soloveitchik, Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik at Boston Yeshiva University. So his name was on the first edition of the RCA's 1960 Siddur, as like sort of the chairman of the Halacha committee of the RCA, and he had his name removed from the second edition, possibly because he didn't like the controversy that it generated. He didn't really want to be associated with it in that way. He didn't want to make it sound like he had approved every aspect of that translation. Another thing that's important to note about Dr. Birnbaum's approach when he translated, when he edited, when he wrote his works, he's scholarly. He's an academic. Remember, he has this PhD from Dropsy. And if you look, for example, at the acknowledgements page of his Siddur, which I have here in source number 7, he says, in the course of his work on the Siddur, the author has consulted many authorities for guidance. He is deeply grateful to Rabbi Chaim Heller for his illuminating suggestions. The writer is equally indebted to Professors Louis Ginsberg, Abraham A. Newman, Chaim Chernovitz, Alexander Marx, Solomon Zeitlin, Saul Lieberman, Joseph Reeder, Israel Efros, Boaz Cohen, Abraham Heschel, and Simon Greenberg for their helpful advice and encouragement. Does anyone want to tell me, start talking about this list? Maybe if someone wants to like start identifying some of these people. If we identify some of them, maybe we'll get a sense of what is remarkable, what Dr. Birnbaum is doing here that you might not find nowadays so much.
They're professors at the seminary.
Some of them professors at the seminary. Right, so we have Louis Ginsberg at the seminary, Abraham Joshua Heschel, Alexander Marx is a librarian at JTS, Saul Lieberman also. Any others people want to identify?
Simon Greenberg.
Oh, he's one I don't know about, actually. Tell me about him.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Simon Greenberg was a professor at the seminary.
Oh, he's also the seminary. Okay, looking for people who are. There were some people who are not at the seminary. Other institutions.
Chernovitz was at Cincinnati.
Okay.
Rav
Yeah.
Zair.
Yeah. So he's really interesting. So this is someone who was also immigrant from Europe. He was involved in yeshivos there, but when he came to America, he actually ended up being at the Jewish Institute of Religion, Reform affiliated.
His yeshiva in Odessa was already regarded as a modern yeshiva.
Already a modern yeshiva, yeah, definitely, yeah. Yeah, so he's another interesting one. Rabbi Chaim Heller, anyone know who Rabbi Chaim Heller was?
He was a Ritz Rosh Yeshiva, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was a Ritz Rosh Yeshiva, exactly. Solomon Zeitlin, anyone?
Not just the Rosh Yeshiva, the Rav loved Reb Chaim Heller.
Yeah.
Reb Chaim Heller was the Rav's Rebbe on Tanakh.
Yeah, I've heard that before, yeah.
Even from Berlin.
He wrote one of his famous Hespedim on Reb Chaim Heller. He wasn't just an ordinary Rosh Yeshiva at YU.
Okay, yeah, great. Yeah.
They already met in Berlin.
Oh, okay, interesting. Okay, yeah. Solomon Zeitlin, anyone?
Wasn't he like kind of between
controversial
Fromm and Wissenschaft in a sense?
Yeah. Wait, sorry, Ariel, who did you say?
Fromm and Wissenschaft, kind of negotiating the boundary between those.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Solomon Zeitlin was at Dropsy. He was a professor there.
He was the American Academy of Jewish Research.
Yeah. He's one of the things he's famous for is denying the early date for the Dead Sea Scrolls. He kind of held out a lot longer than anyone else on that. So
I don't know Joseph Reeder or Israel Efros.
Yeah, neither do I. But anyway, and Abraham Newman was the I think the president of Dropsy at the time. So anyway, I think the point is I'm trying to make here from all these different names is look at the variety of types of people that he's in contact with. He's got YU, he's got JTS, he's got Dropsy. He's really very broad in like what he's drawing from and his sources and what he's willing to do. If you look,
but that's because his Siddurim and Machzorim were found in conservative temples, much as in Orthodox schools.
Right. So I do want to say that, yeah, that like his works were not limited to the Orthodox, and they weren't found in conservative places as well. And also recall he's a Hebrew school teacher, and he's trying to appeal to all types of Jews. He's dealing with people. Not everyone he's dealing with has an Orthodox background, and he's got a lot of cross-denominational friendships friendships as well. Now,
if I'm not mistaken, this acknowledgement page appeared only in the first edition, and subsequently it was removed.
yes.
For marketing purposes.
Yes, you're very good at anticipating that my next point, but also reminding me, because maybe I'm going to forget some of these points. So thank you. Yes, that it was removed. So that does say something. I think maybe it's for marketing purposes, but it does say something about the changing constituency and the changes in the Orthodox community, and how people are going to view sort of this broad cross-denominational approach that Dr. Birnbaum is taking. If you look, for example, at source number 8, this is his commentary to the Megillah. This is Megillah's Esther in particular that he's writing about, and I'll just read this briefly. Diverse opinions have been held on the subject of the historicity of the book of Esther. Well, that already is a pretty big statement. He's admitting something that that's kind of not a typical Orthodox position. I mean, he's basically saying there are those who've said that the story didn't happen. You're not going to see a lot of Orthodox writers saying something like that. Now, he disagrees. But he says, none of these historical objections, however, are successful in view of the ancient observance of the Feast of Purim, which forms a considerable presumption in favor of being founded on facts. According to the biblical scholar Samuel R. Driver of the 19th century, the sacred writer of the book of Esther is well informed on Persian manners and institutions and commits no anachronism. So he's done a bunch of things here. He's brought up a scholarly academic objection to the whole enterprise, to basically to the whole Megillah, but then he tries to disprove it. And part of the way he disproves it is he brings in a non-Jewish biblical scholar and what he said about the customs and the Persian manners at the time. So this really reminds me actually a lot of another writer a little earlier than Dr. Birnbaum who did similar types of things, and that's Rabbi Hertz. Many of you, I'm sure, have used the Hertz Chumash. And that's really what Rabbi Hertz does. All the time, he's bringing in sort of, non-Jewish, non-Orthodox scholars to try to prove points that he wants to make and disprove issues of biblical criticism. So Dr. Birnbaum is really often doing the same thing. That was one of the things that he saw as important, was to quote all these diverse types of opinions and deal with scholarly academic issues in his work. Now, very different, however, from ArtScroll. ArtScroll took a very different approach. Actually, the very first work that ArtScroll did was Megillah Esther in 1976. And Rabbi Meir Zlotowitz, one of the founders of ArtScroll, he writes something very different in his introduction to his work. He says in source number 9 here, "It is in no way the intention of this book to demonstrate legitimacy or historicity of Esther or Mordechai to non-believers or doubters. Belief in the authenticity of every book of the Torah is basic to Jewish faith, and we proceed from there. Rather, the aim was a specifically traditional commentary reflecting the Megillah as understood by Chazal. No non-Jewish sources have ever been consulted, much less quoted. I consider it offensive that the Torah should need authentication from the secular or so-called scientific sources." So as you can see, very, very different than Dr. Birnbaum. In fact, I would go as far to say they're responding specifically to Birnbaum. I think not just Birnbaum. There were also a whole bunch of books called the Sansino books of the Bible that did a similar type of thing, bringing in sort of academic scholarship to bear, but from a relatively Orthodox perspective. But ArtScroll is saying we're changing the game here. We're no longer going to be doing this. We don't need to go outside of sort of a more narrow view of tradition to write a commentary on the Megillah. We're just going to use sources that we consider sort of be the kosher sources, basically, and that's enough. So Dr. Birnbaum's approach is kind of you can see being eclipsed as orthodoxy goes forward.
Yosef,
Yeah. Yes.
I would point out that the second edition of the Sansino Tanakh eliminates all non-Jewish sources.
Yes.
And I asked them about that, and they
Yes.
said it's marketing.
Yes. Oh, you asked them about that. Okay. Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, it's something I've been very interested in also. Someday, we'll see when I get to it. I want to write an article about this, about sort of about the two different editions of the Sansino and sort of the change in what happened. We'll see what more I can learn. Yeah, but it is very interesting. Now, I should also mention at this point Dr. Birnbaum's Zionism. As noted, he was on the board of the Histadrut and he wrote for Hadar. It's actually, I found somewhere it was recorded back in the 1920s already. When he was in Birmingham, he was teaching his students about Herzl and reading them the poetry of Chaim Nachman Bialik. And actually, if you look at the first edition of the Siddur, 1949, as we said, was when it was first published. The last page is the Tefillah Shlomo Medina. the last page is the prayer for the state of Israel. And that's kind of cool because this is like right after the state of Israel is founded. I wonder, I don't know, is this the first appearance maybe of this tefillah in an English siddur? And it's really very prominent in Birnbaum. And as maybe some of you know, our school didn't even include it in their first edition of their siddur. They put it in later into later editions that they did for the RCA, but you see Dr. Birnbaum's approach there is also different from our schools and including that tefillah. That's I apologize for a moment. I'm kind of running the Zoom here, but it's not my forte. I will admit I haven't done a lot of this. I just want to try to if people could try to mute themselves again, I feel like there's a little bit of feedback, so we'll make sure the sound quality is good. I know that I can mute everyone too, but I can't see the control right now. But if people could just mute themselves, that would be helpful. Okay. But I think we've talked about a number of different areas. Before we close, just want to talk about, I think, maybe something that goes more to the heart of Dr. Birnbaum's project. Like, why was he writing all these translations? Why was he doing all these English editions of books? And I think it's because he wanted to really make Jewish texts accessible to the English-speaking masses, regardless of their background. There's a really interesting interview that he did in 1983, the year that he actually published a new translation of the Chumash. And he says, "We are losing our people because of ignorance. People are ignorant of their ignorance. My motivation is to teach. I'm a teacher, an educator. I want to help Jews remain Jews." And I think this really animated a lot of what he did. If you look here in source number 10, this is the introduction to his 1964 book of Jewish concepts. And as I mentioned at the cemetery, this is an alphabetic compendium of so many important Jewish topics, accessible with scholarly explanations as well. And over here, he says what the purpose of the volume is in source number 10. He says, "The purpose of this book is to provide in a single handy volume the essential teachings of Judaism. It is written for those who want an up-to-date and easily intelligible account of basic Jewish concepts, a knowledge of which brings meaning to what may otherwise seem empty phrases. At the present time, when we are confronted with widespread indifference, we have great need of spirituality based upon genuine knowledge of our heritage." So you see really here what he really wants to do. He's really said it all right here. He really wants to spread Jewish knowledge. It's actually interesting. The book of Jewish concepts itself was quite popular. It was selling out nearly immediately. It was already in a third printing by 1967, just a few years later. And there's an interesting article from the Jewish press from 1967, written by Rabbi Tovia Preschel, who did like a portrait of Birnbaum. And this is also one of the sources we have, biographical sources we have on them. And he gives an anecdote there of a lawyer who walked into a Jewish bookstore. And the lawyer says, "I am an Am Haaretz. Give me Birnbaum's book on Jewish concepts." Then after studying with a group of other lawyers, he returned to the bookstore and proclaimed, "I have lost the title, Am Haaretz." You see that the role that Dr. Birnbaum played in ensuring people learned about Judaism in a way that was both high level, but also accessible. He wrote other works like this too. There's another work called The Treasury of Judaism, first published in 1957 and reissued several times, which collects English abridgments of passages in the Tanakh, the Mishnah, the Gemara, Josephus, Zohar, Rambam, Ramban, down to Rabbi Norman Lamb, including Mordechai Kaplan, interestingly enough, and the Reform Rabbi Stephen Wise. So you see both sort of like this sort of the introductory broad scope, also just the range of scholars and writers he's willing to quote and include and have people learn about. Perhaps most surprising in this vein, I think, is actually his work called The Concise Jewish Bible from 1976. It basically is a really abridged version of Tanakh. You look for Sefer Vayikra, you're almost going to miss it in there. It's only 3 pages long, just some of Parshas Kedoshim, some of Emorim, some of Bahar. And it doesn't even seem to be aimed at Jews only. We see sort of how strong this educational impulse that Dr. Birnbaum had. And I think we see the same interest in disseminating Jewish knowledge in his introduction to the Siddur. And I highlighted here, just returning as we near the end here, just some passages he wrote in the intro to the Siddur about the role he thinks the Siddur plays. And he says, "The Siddur is the most important book in Jewish life. The whole gamut of Jewish history may be traversed in its pages. It is a mirror that reflects the development of the Jewish spirit throughout the ages. The Siddur passed through a long process of evolution until it finally emerged as a rich anthology of our literary classics. Judaism demands from its adherents a knowledge of the Bible and the traditions based upon it. Many, however, lack the leisure or the aptitude for such study. Hence, the Siddur has developed in a way that enables every worshiper to become familiar with the various forms of Jewish learning and religious expression. It is regrettable that the Siddur, over which many generations have brooded and wept, has never been sufficiently appreciated as a vehicle for Jewish knowledge. Let me repeat that last line. It is regrettable that the Siddur, over which many generations have brooded and wept, has never been sufficiently appreciated as a vehicle of Jewish knowledge. What is remarkable about that? Anyone want to comment on what's going on here in this introduction? What's missing? What's missing from this introduction? What is he not talking about?
Well, he's not talking about prayer as such. He's talking about understanding and study.
Right. He's talking about studying Jewish history.
Theology.
Yeah.
He's not talking about God.
Right. He's saying the Siddur is a vehicle for Jewish knowledge, Jewish history, imbibing the literary classics. What about praying itself? Look, for example, at the introduction of like the art school Siddur. Actually, the art school Siddur is all about how prayer is an existential need of humankind. Or look here in source number 12. This is what Rabbi Jonathan Sachs in the more recent Koran Siddur. Prayer is the language of the soul in conversation with God. It is the most intimate gesture of the religious life and the most transformative. So he's saying, basically, Rabbi Sachs is saying the Siddur is how we learn to daven, to bare our souls, to beseech our Creator. This is missing from this introduction by Dr. Birnbaum. He actually, interestingly enough, the second edition of the Siddur in 1977, remember the first edition was 1949, so some 30 years later almost, he adds a new section addressing the meaning of prayer, perhaps because he recognized the oversight. But I think what's so interesting, though, is in the first edition that he even had this oversight. I think it's you kind of see, you get a window into Dr. Birnbaum. And what did he want to do? He wanted to educate Jews about Jewish history and about their literature. And he wanted to spread Jewish knowledge to those who had kind of become estranged from it, who didn't know Hebrew that well. So it's kind of understandable, maybe, that he might have left this out initially.
That's not entirely true, because
Yeah.
brooded and wept is an emotional wept to God, not for pure knowledge. So I think even in what you quoted, he still has a religious, brooded and wept is a religious concept. Still,
I agree with you. But he's kind of like almost looking at it a little bit negatively. Maybe I'm misreading this, but like the way I see it, he's saying like they brooded and wept, but that's not really what they should be doing. It's it's like
that's what they did.
Yeah.
So he says you can add knowledge to it, but it really was brooding and weeping. Then add knowledge to it.
Yeah.
I think it's taken for granted that this is a book of tefillah and that this is beseeching God. What it has not been appreciated as is a vehicle of Jewish knowledge. That part of it has been neglected.
Right.
Yeah, sure.
I think we took for granted the fact that this is, of course, beseeching God, and that's the only thing people thought of it.
Yeah. But I do think it's interesting.
Adding the missing element.
Yeah, for sure. He's adding a missing element. I think, but I think like it's just like that's not what people expect to see in an introduction to a Siddur, and that's I think what made his work so unique. And I think that's as I said, that's what's great about what Dr. Birnbaum was doing is that he was bringing this knowledge to the Jewish people.
Well, one might interject.
Yeah.
Rav Dr. Soloveitchik's famous Rupture and Reconstruction about the synagogue he was davening in, of people from Eastern Europe who had that visceral fear on the Yemim Noraim, even if they didn't have text knowledge. So I guess he was thinking, even if they had mimetic something, there was a lot of basic text stuff that needed to be filled in. So perhaps putting it in the Rav Dr. Soloveitchik type paradigm, who was trying to give text to those who were mimetic or less.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. That's true. I think that's right. And as I said, that's a lot of what he was trying to do in his works. And his works were very popular, as I said. Like another thing I noted is that in 1976 they did a second edition of his Haggadah. The first edition was called like Haggadah Shel Pesach or something like that. What the translation commentary of Dr. Philip Birnbaum. And 1976 was just the Birnbaum Haggadah. I mean, his name had just had such currency at that point. He really had became known for doing this type of thing.
May I just say briefly,
yeah.
I'm here in Australia, as is the case, I'm sure, in England. Birnbaum was not as popular because the Singer's Prayer Book and the Routledge Machzor were the default Machzorim and Sidurim. They became more popular in the 1970s. I think in part because his commentary was actually very interesting. You could take it, there'd be a nugget you would read and you would appreciate it. You mentioned, secondly, the fact that he wrote many articles in Hadoar and in other publications. For those who are interested, Mossad Rav Kook, some decades ago, put out a volume with a very lovely title, Pleitas Soifreim, a play on his name, Paltiel and Pleitas, which has a large number of his articles, and they're accessible and very, very good. Finally, the Rov took exception on occasions to some of Dr. Birnbaum's work, not just the commentary, but where at one point in the Yom Tov Amida, he amended the text. There's a reference in Nefesh Horav by Rav Herschel Schechter. He doesn't actually quote Birnbaum, but it is a reference to a certain Siddur, and he's very annoyed at the fact that Dr. Birnbaum took upon himself the authority to amend a text. Having said that, for very many decades, those who wanted to educate themselves in all aspects of Jewish life owe a very, very large debt to Dr. Birnbaum.
Yeah, thank you, David. I really appreciate those additions. Yeah, and definitely, I have yet myself to check out the Mossad Cook volume, and I plan to do that at some point. I just wanted to say basically one more thing before then, just making a summary point, and that was his last work, complete Shul Chumash, Hebrew, English, introduction, some commentary at the bottom. That is not appreciated very much. Like that, it was published in 1983, and for various reasons, it really didn't make an impact. It kind of never took on. But I think that's kind of the. It was a Chumash he wrote, a complete Shul Chumash he did in 1983. It's hard to find. My understanding is the Jewish Center where I am, they do have some copies lying around, and I might look for them right after I finish this this speech. But it was not widely used like what many of his other works. But many of his other works, as we've talked about, were used very widely. So what is Dr. Birnbaum's legacy? He tried to make Judaism more comprehensible, with a flair for academic scholarship, as we said. In a time when Siddurim were confusing, when Hebrew texts were a closed book, he brought them to the masses. Remember, he was doing a lot of his work before the expansion of the day school movement and the spread of Jewish knowledge that really really picked up the pace in the 1960s. When he was gone, Art Scroll jumped into the gap, although it didn't really have the patience for historical investigation and those things like Dr. Birnbaum did. Had a really different focus. I think now Koren publishers in Jerusalem, their works are starting to take up Dr. Birnbaum's charge of fusing accessibility and scholarship together for a new generation, which is great though. Dr. Birnbaum, as we've said, had no children, but he had many students and many books. And I hope and pray that today we have honored his legacy. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to address you. Larry, I'll turn it back to you. Maybe Larry went off. Okay.
No, he's here. He's here.
He's here. Okay. I want to know if Larry, do we have time to do additional questions, or should we stop here because it's 5 o'clock?
Why don't you take maybe 2 questions and then we'll end?
Sounds good to me. All right. Who wants to ask a question?
There is, oh, go ahead. There is a question in the chat. What was the objection of Rabbi Soloveitchik to Birnbaum's text modification of the Yom Tov davening?
Yeah, I think that's probably a question for David, who was talking about
Oh,
that.
Thank you.
Well, I think,
I know the answer to that. I know the answer to that. He bases himself on Rabbi Yaakov Emden, where it says in the Amida, Elokeinu v'Elokei Aviseinu, Ritzevim Nuchoseinu Kadashenu b'mitzvaysecha. He says that Elokeinu v'Elokei Aviseinu should be said on the weekdays and not just on Shabbos. So if it fell during the week, you would say Elokeinu v'Elokei Aviseinu Kadashenu b'mitzvaysecha. And the Rav attacked him for that.
So did Art Scroll attacked him for it and said, but I think Dr. Birnbaum said that he had manuscript support for the idea that this was a scrivener's error somewhere along the line.
Yes, he quotes Rabbi Yaakov Emden. He quotes Rabbi Yaakov Emden. But the Rav said that it was beyond the competency of someone today to amend the Siddur in that fashion.
Well, I'll confess, notwithstanding, when I'm davening privately, I always include Elokeinu v'Elokei Avosenu as a deference to the memory of Dr. Birnbaum. That may confess something. Any other questions before we conclude?
Yeah.
Ted, go ahead.
This is a comment on the variety of people that he consulted with in the earlier part of the presentation. But the commonality of all of those, they were all European born and bred scholarship. So there was a sort of a commonality in a sense of background training that they all shared, regardless of the institutions that they ended up with in America.
That's really actually a really good point. Yeah, that these people kind of diverged when they came to America. They kind of like ended up at different institutions. And it doesn't always reflect, though, their, hashkafa, I guess, always. And also, I do think you're right, though, that like there is a certain, you can see what his interest is. Dr. Birnbaum is interested in the type of work that's very traditional. It's coming from that, background, but at the same time, it's taking a good deal of interesting scholarship. Yeah, but thank you for that.
Yosef, I just want to mention also, you mentioned you were interested in finding copies of Dr. Birnbaum's Chumash from 1980. You're in the Beit Midrash, and if you look very carefully on some of the shelves there, I think you'll find them.
Okay, yeah, that's what I was told. Yeah, I have one at home because I purchased it, but I haven't. I've never seen it in a shul. It really did not make an impact in the way his other works did.
I would just like to say that I am in possession of a Chumash that was inscribed by Dr. Birnbaum before my son Ezra Marbach's bar mitzvah.
Oh, wow.
So it's a real treasure for me.
Wow, that's wonderful.
Oops, there you go again. Thank you. Just clicked on the wrong spot.
Well,
Okay.
Okay.
If we are, I'll say the Kel Malay and we can conclude. This was a beautiful tribute, maybe 20, 30 years too late, for Dr. Birnbaum, and I'm glad we were able to organize it. And once again, I want to thank Yosef Lindell for his persistence and his drive in pushing all of us to put the event together and assemble the necessary things.
Thank you very much, Yosef, for bringing it back to life.
Thank you.
El Malay Rachamim Shochein Mamrimim, Hamtzei Minukon Akonal, Konfei Ashchina.
You muted yourself.
Whoops, sorry, it's my fault. How do I?
Oh, Bavur Shanachna Mispalalim, Bavur Vaskaras Nishmaso, the Ganade Ntiem, Nokem Balachamim, Yastirem Besakanofal the Olamim, Yatrobitrakayim is Nishmaso, Adonai Hu Nakalaso, Bionu Shalom Mishkabo, Benomar, Amen. As I said, we hope that the posted on the Jewish Center website will be a recording of both the event at the cemetery, at which Yosef spoke briefly and Rabbi Schechter spoke at some length, and this event this afternoon. Thank you again all for participating, and thank you, Yosef.
Thank
Larry,
you.
Larry,
Thank you.
Larry,
Thank you, Larry.
Larry Coburn, can you hear me?
And Yishar Koach to both.
Thank you.
Yosef, but Larry Coburn, can you hear me? Apparently not. Birnbaum has Tachas Kanfei HaShechina and not Al Kanfei HaShechina in his Sidur. And Tachas Kanfei HaShechina works better because it's hard to see how Al Kanfei HaShechina creates a Seser. Seser Kenofav works better with Tachas Kanfei HaShechina.
Very nice.
Can you translate that for those of us who didn't understand it?
There are two versions of the Kel Mole. Finding refuge above the wings of the Shekhinah or below the wings of the Shekhinah. And below the wings of the Shekhinah accords better with the subsequent phrase of finding refuge in the wings of the Shekhinah. It's hard to see how the hidden place in the wings of the Shekhinah. Much easier to be hidden below the wings than above the wings.
Ah, thank you, Jim.
Lila Tov, everyone. I'm going to bed.
Okay, wow.
Night.
When can we see what happened at the funeral site, at the
grave.
At the grave?
I'm not sure. I imagine Larry will get to work and help getting the center to post that.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
This was wonderful, just wonderful. Fine person, fine scholar.
Thank you. Yes.
You're aware, of course, he was very careful to try to correct what he thought were some errors that had crept into the grammar of the tefillot.
Yeah.
So for example, in Atachon Antanu, the classic is Atachon Antanu limada Torasecha, right? Limada. And he said Atachon Antanu doesn't take a lamed as an object.
Interesting.
He corrected it to Atachon Antanu mada Torasecha.
Okay. That's interesting. Yeah, I haven't done a lot of extensive research on all of his corrections. I feel like some of them kind of stuck, some of them kind of didn't. If you look at later Sidurim and stuff like that, but it's definitely an interesting topic.
Yeah.
There's a passage in Yom Kippur, I think it's the V'yatayu, where he said there's a phrase Bum Sheonam, and he didn't correct it, but he has a footnote that says it makes no sense, but it's probably the Mishonam, and he gives a source for that. So it's kind of a curious little thing. He didn't go that far.
Yeah. Yeah, there's some interesting things with that. I think toward the very end of the Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur davening, there's the Piyut Hayom Tam Seinu, and all the Mavzorim have the order one way, and he switches the order of some of the verses to make them alphabetical. Now I know that like that whole Piyut is based on a longer Piyut that's not said in full, of which I think there are also different versions of, but it's interesting that he kind of switched to the order, and I don't know on what authority he did that, if it was kind of just like, I think this should be alphabetical, so I'm going to do it, or he actually had like another machzor that he was copying from that did that. I'm not sure, but it's interesting that he made like various small changes throughout the davening like that.
David, since you're familiar with the Rav's objections to the Birnbaum, did he express an objection to the fact that Birnbaum omitted in the the Rav held that Ana was essential to the introduction to Hasham No Bagadnu, but the Birnbaum does not have it, does not have the word Ana. Did he ever mention that that was an objection, David? Maybe, I don't know if I can be heard.
I can hear you.
Are you aware that the Birnbaum Machzor does not have the word Ana Tavo, Ana, and the Rav, as quoted by Rabbi Luckstein, was insistent that Ana was essential.
Yes, I'm saying that comment that I mentioned about Rabbi Yaakov Emden, that was quite well known. but there were many other comments that the Rav made just in conversation, and it's not possible to know what his attitude was. In general, he took a dim view about amending the text. He thought that was beyond competence, and it speaks to me. I very much like when Dr. Birnbaum points out in his comments what he thinks are perhaps mistakes or emendations, but I don't like it when he goes to the next stage and actually changes the text. That's a step too far for me. That's all I can say about it. He was his own man. That's clear. He was his own man. He took counsel from scholars, great scholars, but in the end, he had the broad shoulders to make his own decisions, and for that, he should be commended.
Here, here.
Yeah. This is a really fascinating additional discussion. No one should feel the need to continue, but maybe the Zoom, I think I should probably get off now also. But the Zoom may continue. I'm not sure if the meeting is going to end when I end it. If it doesn't, the rest of you are welcome to continue talking, but I think I'm going to end the meeting now.
Once again, thank you, Joseph. At least for this afternoon or for this morning in Australia, you brought Dr. Birnbaum for a few hours back to life. No small task.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much for participating.
Shkoyach Yosef. Very much appreciated.
All the very best.
All right. All the same to you. Bye.
Goodbye.